Hello and welcome to another Leeds Food History Symposium video. In this video I'm going to look at recreating an early 18th century recipe. Now this recipe I found whilst doing some research in Derby Local Studies around about 10 years ago, and it comes from a manuscript called The House Handbook of Peter Geary. Now Peter Geary was the bailiff of Derby in the early 17th century. And this house handbook was basically a notebook in which he made various notes on household management. Some of the earliest entries are a series of medicinal recipes from the 17th century. But the handbook was clearly, the notebook was clearly used through subsequent generations. And we've got in there also some culinary recipes that are somewhat later. Now these date from the time of Thomas Geary, who was the mayor of Derby in 1717. And we know this because there are a series of dinners and banquets that are described in amongst the recipes, and those are dated, and they're dated to 1717. One in particular is for the assizes at Derby in April 1717, and the recipe next to that is for something called Derby cakes. Now, I'm from Derbyshire and I never heard of Derby cakes. I went out into Derby and had a look around in the shops, and they've got Derby biscuits for sale. Having a look on the internet on Glyn Hughes's Foods of England website, he does have some entries for Derby biscuits and also the name Derby cakes. And if you think about it, when you think about Shrewsbury biscuits are also called Shrewsbury cakes. So cakes can become biscuits through time. And a couple of so he's got a couple of recipes on there, 19th century recipes. One from 1830, which is for Derby or shortcakes, and one from 1854, which is for Derby or Yarmouth biscuits. And I recommend having a look at Glyn Hughes's Foods of England website because it really is a fantastic resource. The earlier recipe says to take 1 pound of butter and 2 pounds of sifted flour, and to put in a pound of currants, a pound of sugar, an egg, and mix that together with half a pint of milk. And this is making what it describes as round cakes, but I would think we'd probably call them shortbreads or something like that. They're more biscuity. So the recipes from the 19th century are quite different to the recipe from the early 18th century that I found. And I'll just read that recipe out to you. It says to take a strike of flour. Now, a strike was a measure of weight, of volume, I should say, used commonly for grain in the early modern period into the medieval period. And it's the same as a bushel. A bushel was the word that was used in the south of England. A strike was the word that was used in the Midlands and the north to mean the same thing. Strike of flour would have been around about 40 pounds in weight, around about 20 kilos, 18-20 kilos. So this is a considerable amount of flour, and we're making a big recipe here. Strike of flour, 8 pounds of sugar, 8 pounds of currants, 3 quarts of good ale barm. Now this would have been the yeast off of the top of the brew, and that was used by brewers to brew again. That's basically the yeast. They take it off the top of the beer or the ale that they've brewed. And what they could also do, they could also sell it, or they did also sell it to bakers to bake with as a raising agent, and also to use in making cakes as well. So we've got 3 quarts of good ale barm, 3 ounces of cinnamon, an ounce of ginger or nutmeg, and an ounce of cloves and mace. So we have spices in this recipe which we don't have in the later Derby biscuits, and 20 pounds of butter, so a considerable amount of butter. You're to mix your spices, currants and sugar in the flour, then melt the butter and put it to the flour, put in the barm, and then a pint of sack as well. Sack was a kind of sweet wine, a bit like sherry. To mix your cakes and make them up as big as 2-penny cakes. So these would be fairly substantial size. But the cakes should be lighter than manchet, it said. The manchet was the finest bread from the medieval period again into the early modern period. Manchet was that word that was used for the finest bread. So these cakes should be as lighter than the finest bread. So our recipe for Derby cakes has the ingredients but doesn't really have much in the way of instruction other than that they're to be made as big as twopenny cakes and that they're to be lighter than Manchet. So it's interesting I think it's informative to turn to some other recipes to get a bit more background information. Gervase Markham in the English Housewife from the early 17th century gives a recipe for making Manchet bread, and he advises to use 3 pints of ale balm to a bushel of meal. So that's the same amount of flour here, a bushel is the same as a strike, and we are to use 3 pints of ale balm, though half as much as in the Derby cake recipe, which uses 3 quarts. Now undoubtedly we need more raising agent in the Derby cakes because of all the butter, because of the currants, the sugar that's in there as well. Markham also advises that the dough is to be left to rise an hour before baking. So that's a useful thing to bear in mind, and we'll probably need to do that as well for the Derby cakes. Another recipe that's interesting to use in comparison to this is a recipe for wigs. Now wigs were a spice cake that were commonly eaten in the 18th century, and this recipe also comes from Derbyshire. This is from the early 18th century from a recipe book, a manuscript recipe book in the Derbyshire archives that formerly belonged to the Wright family of Eam Hall. And the recipe for wigs in this cookbook, this recipe book, has 4 pounds of flour, 2 pounds of butter, so again a similar proportion to the Derby cakes, 2 to 1. It's got caraway seeds in it, which obviously the Derby cakes don't have, cloves and mace, a quart of good ale yeast, 2 eggs, 2 spoonfuls of rose water, and 4 or 5 spoonfuls of sack. So again we're using that sweet wine, and that is what they're using to make wigs at Eam Hall. And they do, though, this recipe does also give a little bit more information about how they are to be made up. And it says once you've made your paste, your dough in this case, let it lie a little, then cut into bits as big as you please, then roll them up and prick them as they're going into the oven. So you have to make little holes in them. And your oven must be pretty quick, but not too hot. And a quarter of an hour will bake them. So we've got information there about how long they're going to take as well in the oven. So it's useful, these 2 recipes, Markham's one for Manchet bread and the one from Eam Hall for making wigs, are very useful to bear in mind when we come to make our Derby cakes. So this is our list of ingredients reduced down. We've got 8 ounces or 250 grams of plain flour, 4 ounces or 125 grams of butter, which we're going to melt, 1.5 ounces or 50 grams of currants, a similar amount of sugar, a teaspoon of dried yeast, half a tablespoon of sherry or some other sweet wine, half a teaspoon of cinnamon, a pinch each of ginger, nutmeg, mace and cloves. Okay, so we've got our ingredients now. So in this bowl I've got 8 ounces of plain white flour, so that would have been, I guess, equivalent to Manchet flour or something like that. They would have had the finest white flour anyway, because that's what they were talking about in the recipe, about these things being finer, lighter than Manchet. So we've got flour, we've got a teaspoon of dried yeast. Now I've gone by again equating Manchet with white bread, and when I'm making a loaf of white bread I will use something like a teaspoon of yeast to a pound of flour. So given that this is supposed to be, from looking at some of those other recipes, twice as much yeast, I've effectively put twice as much yeast for the amount of volume of flour into this mix. So a teaspoon for 8 ounces rather than a teaspoon for a pound. what else has gone in here is we've got 1.5 ounces of currants, 1.5 ounces of sugar. We've got a pinch of each of the spices. We've got some cinnamon, we've got ginger, nutmeg, mace and cloves in there as well. 1.5 ounces of sugar, I think I mentioned that, that's in there. So to this we've now got to add the wet ingredients, if you like. So we've got some melted butter here, 4 ounces of melted butter. I've got some warm water to add in to get it to sort of a dough consistency, depending on how much we need, because obviously the ale balm had some water, would have had some liquid in it, whereas the dried yeast obviously doesn't, so we might need some more liquid. And then 1/2 tablespoon of, in this case, marsala. Basically it's the sweet wine. So that's in a lot of the recipes, and it's optional, you don't have to put it in, but as I say, a lot of the 18th century recipes, including the ones for wigs as well as the one for Derby cakes, has a little sweet wine, sack or canary or something similar. So, you know, I've got some marsala here, so I'm going to put 1/2 tablespoon of that in. So, right, first of all, in with the butter. Whoop. That in there. Give that a bit of a mix around. And yeah, we're definitely going to need some more marsala in as well. And we are going to need some more liquid in there to get this to come together as a dough. So a little bit more. Yeah, it's going to need a little bit more than that. Okay, a bit more again. And I reckon we're going to be about right now. I'll have to go in with my hands now. Right. Okay, yeah. That's about right. Okay. Now then. Okay, so dough's been left for about an hour. It's not risen much, so I'm now going to shape it into some little cakes. I think for this amount, probably about 4 would be sufficient. So I'll just split it into 4 and then roll them into roughly circular shapes, and then put them on here. Oops. Cake shapes. This is pretty rough and ready. Flatten that one down a bit maybe. Okay, so the advice was to prick them as well. That was for the wigs. So I'm going to do that with these as well. I'm just going to use a fork. Not. Okay, right. So these are our finished Derby cakes, and they've turned out really good actually. They're really light and they taste really nice. I did them in the end for just over 15 minutes in the oven. They started to go brown, and so I took them out at that point, and I think they are a success. So there we have our Derby cakes made to a recipe from 1717. I wonder just how far back Derby cakes go. Shrewsbury cakes, for example, are mentioned going back into the early 1600s. And it's possible that Derby cakes originate back into the 17th century, or maybe even earlier. Or maybe they were invented by Mayor Thomas Geary in 1717. At this stage, really just don't know. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and thanks very much for watching. Bye.